So, as I said, the purpose of this session is to facilitate a discussion among you about this topic. So I'll start with a general introduction. For those who didn't catch it, I'm Joy Liddicoat, and my day job is working for the Association for Progressive Communications, which is an international NGO and which works around ICTs and development. So I'll just give a general few provocations about the topic, and then, as I say, open up for you. And the first thing to say is that there currently is no universal right to access the internet. It's a common misconception that various declarations or resolutions from governments have created a new right to access the internet. It's not true. But it is true that there is a lot of debate at present about whether or not internet access should be a right. It's true that there's a lot of discussion about how and why human rights matter online, or if they do. There's a lot of discussion about what access to the internet means, and there's a lot of declarations flying around about sort of core values or core principles about the internet being open, free, rights to privacy, and so on. They come from different organisations, probably the most famous one starting in 1996 with John Perry Barlow's Declaration of the Independence of the Internet. And there's many, many other interrelated topics. And there are new sort of global conversations about human rights and access to the internet, the most recent of which is this one, which was a couple of weeks ago. 82 governments from around the world affirmed the very basic principle that the same human rights that we have offline apply online. And now you might think, well, that's an obvious statement to make. But in fact, this has been a highly contested debate. In fact, some governments have argued the internet is simply a networked set of computers, and therefore how can rights be relevant at all to that? Others have said that there's nothing specifically in rights documents that applies to new technologies, and therefore the internet's not captured. The resolution itself, as I said, has this very basic premise that the same human rights apply offline as online, including the right to freedom of expression, which should apply regardless of frontiers. While there is no universal right to access the internet, it's true that the current obligations on governments' existing human rights do require them to take action in relation to access to the internet. And those include having some sort of infrastructure plan around access. For example, there are governments around the world where not rolling out access to the internet is a deliberate attempt to preclude people from being able to exercise rights online. Access to content, including content in local languages, and accessibility issues, some of which of these topics we've talked about through the last 2 days in the NetHui. So apologies to Martin Luther King for this terrible quote, I'm sorry. I had a stream. So you might remember that Vikram Kumar started his opening address to the NetHui, saying 2012 was the year of people power. And it has been globally, very much so. If we think about the activists in Tahrir Square in Egypt, if you think about action against SOPA and PIPA, 140,000 websites worldwide shut down in protest for a domestic piece of legislation. So definitely I had a stream. The London riots, you might recall that in Egypt there was a shutdown of access to the internet during time of unrest. And this idea was also proposed during the UK riots. And one of the questions being asked is, well, what's the difference between a repressive regime shutting down access to the internet and a democratic regime doing so in times of social unrest? And how do we negotiate that, and who decides? We're also seeing first, second, and third generation interferences, if you like, with the internet. So in the early days of the internet, governments, most governments sort of didn't interfere. They weren't quite sure what was going on. And most kind of covered up their interference or their surveillance of online activities with a bit of a fig leaf. And second generation, what we've seen is governments becoming more overt about their interference with online rights or their surveillance. So saying that we're doing this to protect citizens, that it's our obligation to track data, to track privacy information and so on in order to know what citizens are doing online. And third generation, what we're seeing is basically things like astroturfing, so creating fake grassroots movements to attract people to join them and then using those to carry out surveillance and harass and detain people in different countries. So basically using the available platforms to carry out surveillance and track and harass people in violation of their rights. And also challenges to the role of internet intermediaries. I mean, the internet grew on the basis that internet intermediaries weren't liable for content transmission. And now we're in a world where governments are saying to intermediaries, well, you're not going to be liable for content online if you're liable for content online. In other words, if you act progressively to interfere and track on our behalf content that we deem illegal. And so the challenges that we've got are, in New Zealand, I frequently find, and talk about this topic, people say, well, there's kind of complacency. We're okay here. We don't really need to worry about what's going on. Most people can speak freely online, can associate freely online. And, you know, what's the big deal? And I think when you think about the global nature of the internet, I think that's when you make the connection about how, you know, your rights and your ability to exercise your free speech online aren't being exercised only in New Zealand. They're actually being broadcast globally, and there are governments which want to prevent you being able to talk with people in other countries about some of the ideas and opportunities that you see. And we're also seeing that New Zealand voices are pretty much absent from some of those global debates that I'm talking about. The New Zealand government didn't, for example, affirm the UN resolution on freedom of expression. Why? Well, we don't know. Probably because they just weren't at the UN that day. And that's you know, a question that I have as well, you know, what are our interests in participating in that global conversation, and do we have any? We're seeing kind of rights attrition. We don't see a really clear rights framework being applied to copyright laws, to privacy laws. It's kind of piecemeal. And so I worry that, you know, maybe one of the issues is going forward, what will the picture look like in 10 years? And internet public policy, increasingly to register a domain name, you're having to give more information online. Some proposals are to verify your identity before you can register a domain name. And increasingly law enforcement, police are asking registrars for your data, your bank account data and things like that, again without your knowledge. And that's matters of public policy and how we involved in that. So that's probably enough from me, just some ideas to get you started. My thoughts around discussion questions include, you know, what does internet access mean to you, particularly in terms of your rights and your freedoms online? What's impacting on your internet access? Have you noticed any of these issues? Are some of these being talked about in your communities? Do rights actually matter online? I mean, some people say we created the internet in order to get away from all that stuff and to be free. So why are we having to have this conversation now? And share your ideas. If you are interested in topics, talk to each other about what you think you know, we should be doing or others should be doing on these topics. Okay, so that's my discussion started. Please, we'll start with you.
So the important thing is, what does access mean? To me, it's the ability to buy internet access. It doesn't mean that I get it for free or someone gives it to me. It's that you have the ability to buy it if you want it. If you don't want internet access, then it's not forced upon you, or you can go without.
Thanks. Other views? Yep.
Hello. There are a couple of standard definitions out there for universal service and universal access, and I think what you were talking about really was universal service, whereas you can get it, everyone should be able to get the same service everywhere. Universal access is the concept that everyone should be able to afford it.
Just an observation. Certainly in the international debates, access hasn't only been about cost, but certainly cost is one aspect. So if, for example, pricing regimes prohibit or prevent, or in actual fact act as barriers to access, then that's a factor inhibiting access. But there's also the aspect of once you're online, then how free is that space? So it's not just only getting online, It's staying online, being online, and freedom to create content. So, but other views, thoughts? Jim? And then
I'm quite keen on the idea of commons and the common ownership, really. And I guess that for me the internet provides access to a commons. And possibly one that we don't define normally, because we don't necessarily think about it in the same way that we don't think about cooperation, particularly, though we spend a good part of our day cooperating, or we don't spend an awful lot of time thinking about communicating either during the day. So I'm quite interested in the idea of a commons, a social commons, an economic commons, and almost reviving that idea and trying to, or exploring it and trying to introduce the idea of the internet into that kind of idea.
Thanks, Jim. Yes?
The other thing for access is filtering. So we have governments around the world trying to filter the internet, and should universal access to the internet include an unfiltered feed? I don't think too many governments around the world would agree with that. Even in New Zealand, if you've signed up to one of the major ISPs, you're filtered. The DIA runs a filtering program, and they can put anything they want on that, and so all of a sudden you don't have universal access to the whole of the internet anymore.
Hamish? Yep.
I think we need to move on very quickly from this access question, because as a result of being at other presentations, we've got interesting elaborations like triple divides and, affordability, competence, confidence, all of the things that, we can go on. It is a subject in and of itself. And I'd like to get to the human rights parts of it. So I'd take Jim's definition, which I saw Joel nod at, which is, can I buy access to the internet? Then we get on to, I think, the next question that Jim's raised, which is filtering. Does universal access mean you can access everything? Well, absolutely not. Geo-IP identification and denial of service. People get blocked because they're in certain countries that originate a great deal of spam. There is censorship for the variety of reasons that states like to do that kind of thing. But when it gets to this human rights thing, I'm really puzzled by the response that you described from some governments that, no, the internet's just a collection of computers. Well, the press is just a collection of bits of metal and paper and ink. And yet we consider freedom of the press to be one of those human rights. And we believed that when not many humans had access to presses and the like. So that just seems farcical to me. And I think the thing that, do rights exist online? Ask any copyright holder. They definitely think they do. And I guess my position on human rights on the internet, particularly Article 19, the exchange of information, is that it's really, really hard, once I've got access to the internet, filtered or not, for you to stop me having that ability. And it just may be that the internet provides a precursor to a bunch of information exchange rights and Jim's commons that we don't need the state to guarantee anymore. It's just you try and take it off us. And Soper and Pippa might have attempted to do.
Thanks, Hamish. Yeah, and I think that issue of filtering is a really good one. And we tend to think of filtering in terms of the DIA filter, but certainly one of the things that's happened in the last 2 or 3 years is the escalation of the number of filters that are in public Wi-Fi spaces and in public places, in cafes, restaurants, and so on, where content and your ability to get online in those places is either monitored, keywords are listed or, certain information blocked. It's kind of just happened without necessarily a wider social discussion about, are there some basic principles and rights in there about access in public places, and where do we negotiate it? Other comments, Joel?
Kia ora. I think this goes back to what we were talking about yesterday in the other session, which was about
Can you hold the mic up?
perhaps a right to have and hold information. So it's if you've been given something or you've got a right to communicate, I think it's a right to communication, which comes under sort of freedom of expression, freedom of religious expression, all those type of things. I think that's bundled up into what we're talking about here. We need to kind of draw it out a little bit, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, there's an awful lot of focus on freedom of expression, and I think that's rightly so, but there are other rights. For example, as part of the surveillance in the lead-up to the UK riots that was happening online, for example, Facebook requires you to use a real name when you're registering a Facebook page, or if you're an organisation, to say you're an organisation. And one of the tactics of some of the law enforcement agencies was to contact Facebook in relation to either known anonymous Facebook users, people who are clearly using monikers or pseudonyms, and ask Facebook to take them down. And a number of those were related to political protests. And this was it's happened in Malaysia, it's happened in Indonesia, it's happened in a number of different countries. So it's not only simply our ability to speak online, but also how to organise online and the tools that are being used to organise in online spaces. It'll be interesting to see whether those sorts of things happen in the New Zealand context or even in the wider Pacific region. But any other thoughts on sort of the points that are raised about? Yes.
Just wanted to pick up on the public space thing, because I remember an example you gave us last year around the filtering in what you may consider a public space in McDonald's. I think it was the example you gave. Is that a public space or is that a private thing that you choose to log on to? And I think that's possibly something that needs to be defined, where sort of the free Wi-Fi around Wellington may be easier to define as a public space than something where you go into another person's premises and are granted use of their. I don't have an opinion either way, but I think it's a definition that you need to say. Is it public or is it actually
It's
a
good
private
question.
contract?
I mean, what do others think? Yes.
Just on the private thing, the problem becomes then, so Vodafone and Telecom and all those other companies are private companies, except you buy internet access straight off them. So they're obviously not public companies, but they're still private companies, but then you run into, they can run their own filtering if they want. And what happens when all of the ISPs in a country sign up to either a single filter, or the DIA filter, or they run their own filters, and all of a sudden you can't get unfiltered access to the internet because it's all run by private companies, and they have a right to do what they want on their network, and everyone in the country is filtered. I mean, how do you get around that, or how do you stop that from happening?
Yeah, at the back.
Well, as usual, William Gibson said most things that I like to repeat, so I'll make no exception in this case. I mean, he said that one of the things that our grandkids will find the quaintest about us is that we try to delineate between the digital world and the real world. And he said it will literally be impossible to do that in future. If you think about that from a rights perspective, one of the basic tenets of human rights has always been that they're indivisible. You can't go trading them away and saying, I'll have a bit of this one and more of that one, less of that one. So looked at through that perspective, we have fundamental rights of self-expression and so on through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so on that we count on in an offline world. Why would you assume that those things don't translate holus bolus into the online world? So I think the fundamental question is, what if any of those limitations? Why would you require limitations that, as you make the jump from offline to online?
Thanks. Jim? Yep.
I'd just like to go back to the commons and look at the historical example of the loss of commons, and perhaps draw an analogy there that we've talked about the access from the point of view of providers and telecoms and what have you. My very simplistic view of the commons in the past was land that everybody could draw from. You could go and pick up sticks and light a fire, for instance. You could graze your cattle, and do myriad other things. You know, pick your herbs, live your life, and far back enough, you would be able. There would be a sharing and a cooperation. At the moment, what we have is something that seems to be materially really important to everybody's life, and somehow or other somebody's put a paddock between you and common land, and are charging you for to access to cross land that's suddenly been made private. I think it's possible to think of the internet in material terms, with material consequences if access is denied, which allows you then to think whether or not it should be free, for instance, and universally available, and deserving, really. The concept of human rights didn't arrive at a time when it would have been possible to save the real common lands, but we have that opportunity now to look for a human rights framework to give us a commons in the internet itself.
Thanks, Jim. Other views or something that you feel entirely differently that hasn't come up yet? Chris.
There's another aspect to the way these rights arise that I think we also need to consider, and that is that governments are tending to put a lot of material solely online. And I think in particular of a field that's close to what I used to be involved in, and that's of conveyancing of land. It's just about impossible now to convey land and deal with land unless you have the appropriate program from Land Online and can log into that and be an appropriate person approved by the registrar to get into that system. And that's probably quite good if you're a lawyer, because you now have a sort of a quasi-monopoly, whereas in the past it was always available to an individual to go and do their own conveyancing if they chose. Now you need to buy the program and have access to the internet. And that's an example of initiatives that are taking place by the government. And you can look at this in terms of a social contract between the government and its citizens. If they're going to take steps which mean that you must have access to the internet, then that must also flow that to the extent that the government has any power to do so, they must ensure that the citizens have that access. And while on one hand you can look at it in contractual terms as someone saying, yes, well, you have access to it, but you have to pay for it because it's a service, once the government starts putting a lot more stuff online, such as the ability to apply for a social welfare benefit and such like, how are you going to ensure that those at the bottom of the heap are going to have that access when they can't even afford to have a cell phone contract to get online? So, I mean, there are some aspects caused by those sorts of actions we need to consider as well.
Thanks, Chris. I know this was something, that you raised the other day, so I just passed to her and then back to you. Sorry, just in response to that question.
Kia ora, Didas, Computers and Homes, Di Daniels, sorry. Identity crisis. Something you might not also, I want to totally agree with that, and also you might not know, but the Correspondence School are putting all their modules, learning modules online, and they've now realised that in so doing, that a lot of children don't have access, children on correspondence lessons don't have access to the internet. So there's a bit of they're in quite a conundrum about this. And it's not just about children in rural areas who are or are remote. There's a high number of students who are on correspondence schooling because they've been excluded from school, so they're in the cities. So we have actually been attempting to make some kind of bridge and headway here, but if a child has been excluded from school, even if we run computers in homes through that school, then that family might not be welcome at that school. So it's quite a bind. I don't have an answer to that at the moment, but certainly it's just another aspect of when the only way to access something is online, and then people don't have access to that. I think it is a human rights issue.
Yeah, thanks, Di. Certainly in terms of the right to education, I think that's completely clear. Yes?
My name's Daniel. So if the government is moving to put more and more stuff online, and eventually you have to be online to interact with certain parts of the government, say, we'll go to, as an example, to drive a car you have to have a rego and a warrant. And so the rego you have to pay to the government, but on the other hand, the government uses our tax money to build the roads and maintain the roads. And so if you want a car, you have to pay the rego, but you're also paying taxes towards the roads and ACC and whatever. Or if you don't want a car, you could take public transport, and tax money also goes towards public transport. So I can see an argument there for if the government requires you to interact with them only online, then the government should subsidise somehow through taxpayers' money internet access. That doesn't necessarily mean they pay for it outright, but there's how things work now with cars and public transport and whatever. I can see that giving people internet access could be something that would come up and that maybe you would have to have a look at.
Interesting idea. Other thoughts?
We were talking about this yesterday, actually. It came up, I'm not sure what session it was in, but we were talking about basically adding some sort of community services card-like schema, which gave you some sort of subsidy for service provision. I think that would probably work fairly well. You'd have to admin it, of course, and there's overheads, but I think the argument Daniel makes is that if they're only providing online services, which I think is the trend, then there is certainly a right to be able to access your state's services. And if so, then they should be providing some sort of facilities for that to happen.
Thanks, Joel. Roger?
Yes, there's something I struggle with in these discussions, and I conceptualise cyberspace as this cloud up there, and it allows me to go anywhere and get anything I want. But internet is actually an interconnected set of networks. That's where it comes from. That's where it is. And those are all private networks. So somehow there's been this jump between an interconnected set of private networks, and on your own private network you can do whatever you want. Filter, control, access. I mean, it's like a private house, a private shop. And then suddenly we get this jump into cyberspace, which is somehow become a human right to access it. Maybe it's become something that everybody uses. Yet it's still only commercial activity underneath it. I mean, I was just taking the road analogy. I think the roads is a good infrastructure. But they aren't privately owned. They used to be privately owned and interconnected. But they're not now. They're owned by the state in some sense. So that we have a right as a citizen to use that road. So I just find this mental jump from an interconnected set of private networks into cyberspace. The other thing that puzzles me, if I can, and just to go off a separate tangent, every time I see the word rights, I always think of the word responsibilities. Because for all rights, there are corresponding responsibilities. And again, in talking about rights of access to the internet, I try to think exactly what are the responsibilities that go with it.
Thanks, Roger. Other comments? Hamish, I see you reaching for the microphone.
I just, when I hear the rights and responsibilities argument, they're not rights, they're rewards for being responsible. You can shout fire in a crowded cinema, particularly if it is burning. So no, I think rights are those things that you just get. They come from God. They're not granted by the state. They may well be protected by the state, but if you want to be responsible with them, that's a choice, and I would encourage people to make it. But the minute I hear responsibilities, I'm just wondering who's going to define those for me so that I can live up to them for them. Now, in terms of these are private networks, that's good, and certainly these private networks, and I'll take your transport analogy, Roger, because in railways, in larger countries where there are multiple operators, yes, they did. They had to interconnect. It was an obligation, I think, in the Missouri Constitution that you could run a railway that would be acceptable, or a canal, but as part of the social contract or the deal was that you would then be a common carrier, that you couldn't select what you were going to carry or not carry, and that you would interconnect with other services that existed. So yes, it's a private network, but it engages some public responsibilities because it is granted some special status around that common carrier and freedom of liability for third-party activities. And then I think the other thing about it is that we have a school network that is provided by the state that does not preclude the existence of private schools. So if we have a series of private networks that form the internet, there's actually nothing to stop the state from setting up either the voucher idea where we make it accessible to all, and sorry, I don't know enough about it to remember the name of that card that you mentioned, social services card. There's certainly nothing to stop the state setting up its own network, its own ISP, if it feels that that is the best way to solve the problem of universal access. And I fully agree that if the state obliges you to comply with its monopoly coercive power, then it must also make some effort to ensure that that is possible. So if you have to use the internet and you don't have it of your own, then yes, I think they need to contribute to people's access. And then I think we've probably got back to to Jonathan's universal. Now, what was it? Access or?
ITU defines both universal service and universal access.
I'll just get the microphone to Jonathan.
But instead of beating a dead horse, I might talk about something thought about in the mHealth session yesterday. Health services can be offered to people via telephone because there are such things as 0800 numbers. Some people on hardwired ISP plans have what's called zero-rated traffic for some entertainment services. Say, for example, what's that new QuickFlix? QuickFlix has made an agreement with Orcon so that all Orcon customers can get QuickFlix data for free. Well, what needs to happen in the mobile space, especially since people in lower socioeconomic situations are mostly accessing the internet via mobile, is the idea of zero-rated websites, or the idea of bill-back websites, so that the government, in fact, would pay the various mobile operators directly for the amount of traffic consumed by those accessing by mobile. Anyone can go pick up a smartphone these days. Really, anyone can. Even hand-me-downs will do the web at $50. And if that device could have a zero-rated access to government services, that would probably be a very good way of being inclusive.
Thanks, Jonathan. Reg, and then anyone else who's sitting there wondering what it's all about, or why haven't they talked about this obvious issue that you want to?
Yeah, just following up on John's point there, you know, we've always been able to make a 111 call free of charge.
Can you put that microphone a little bit closer to? Yeah.
We've always been able to make a 111 call free of charge. You know, so how much further do you extend that? Really, is the issue. You know, and I agree with John that health services that can be potentially delivered over line, you know, either they're delivered free or the government subsidises them, or, you know, some factor is put in there to ensure that what we call essential services are made available and access is provided relatively easy. The big issue then becomes determining what is an essential service rather than a luxury service, you know, and who makes that decision? Well, it's the same person, Amish, that makes the decision between rights and responsibilities. Ultimately, it's the elected government, and if you don't like the way they make that decision, you know, you can vote for another government.
Thanks. I mean, just picking up on the private-public point, Roger, and thanks for raising it. I mean, I think one thing that's been interesting in the last 5 years is to see increasingly the private sector call for and reach out for rights as a way to push back against governments who are increasingly, in some countries, asking to interfere with the operation of those networks, either to carry out surveillance or to collect data. And the traditional, you know, position of business has been, well, yeah, human rights stuff is not really for private sector, it's governments and the public space. But increasingly being uncomfortable with being asked to interfere, for example, with SMS blackouts or prevention of keywords being used on search engines and so on. We've seen some of the platform providers become more engaged in ways they haven't been before. And we've also seen some quite interesting tools that private sector is starting to use to reveal those. So, for example, Google's transparency report. Anyone familiar with the Google transparency report? One or two? Some, yeah, basically they publish annually the number, you know, the requests that they get, the raw data requests that they get from governments for, you know, takedown of material or access to personal information. If you just Google transparency report, you'll see it. And I mean, it's collated data and it's raw data, but it's an interesting way for them to kick back those and reveal, in a sense, the way governments have been asking them to interfere with rights and the ways in which they seem unreasonable. I'm not using, I mean, I think Google's also problematic in some other respects around its service provision, so I'm not holding them up. But I do think it's interesting to see those innovations from private sector, which I don't know that we would have seen in the absence of some of that internet-specific activity. Other questions, comments? Yes, recall. Good to keep those microphone people on their toes.
Thank you. I'd like to share the historical background about internet access universal service, because I just finished my PhD thesis of that chapter. I think, I thought it started...
A brief summary.
Yeah, I thought it started from Maitland report, the famous The Missing Link. This really discuss about universal access service, but as you know, ITU ignored totally. But my supervisor suggested to discussion about UNESCO, about new order of information. UNESCO led to discussion about 70 to 80, and famous McBride report. Again, it was rejected by US and UK. Before that, there is space development between US and Soviet Union, and also decolonization has started in the 50s. So many new developing countries requested their rights of using space, and I think that is really start of the right of access to internet. So I just write the history from 1950 to current WSIS discussion and whatever.
Okay,
Thanks.
Yeah, please, and get the microphone over to us.
I think there's a lot of discussion of rights online, and there needs to be the flip side of why is government interfering sometimes or stuff. So, you know, the web filter that my department runs is done because the web is an increasingly dodgy place with a lot of child sex abuse images being traded. You know, so how do we achieve a balance now? A web filter deals with a very small proportion of the issue, but it still addresses it. The protections put in place are fairly strong around if you come onto a website, we have no idea who comes on to the filter, who gets filtered. We have things around you can always request something to be reviewed. It goes to the Chief Ombudsman and the Chief Censor. Then there's also other things around, why have we taken the voluntary stance rather than the regulated stance? And that's actually protection. If the department starts blocking things that ISPs disagree with, that are blocked, then they just leave. And you compare this to the UK model, where at the moment they're having a debate about when you sign up for an ISP, you should now indicate that you want to see porn. Not child sex abuse, it's actual just porn.
Lawful, yeah.
So, the position we're trying to take in this country seems to be a lot more balanced than a lot of other countries. Our web filter is very limited in what it does, but I appreciate people don't like it, so be it, but that's it is a real harm that is being combated.
Debbie?
You said before that general agreement that rights offline should match those online, and I think one thing that concerns me is how we treat the internet differently sometimes, and I don't like this increasing trend for due process to be shoved aside and the rights of people, if you like, overstepped in the sake of law enforcement or whatever. And I think one thing that we've got to keep in mind is that we're common law countries and due process is a main part of what holds us to the standards we have. And I think instead of, if you like, compromising that due process, we should find innovative ways to actually maintain our common law approach and due process while actually, if you like, adapting to the speed of the internet. But I don't think we should compromise the values in that and what we actually stand for.
Thanks, Debbie. Joel?
So this is just going back to the internet filter. I have a...
Can you hold the microphone to your mouth? Sorry.
I have a fairly distant acquaintance who works within the DAA serious fraud special investigations team, and we went around to their house for dinner a few weeks ago, and we just started talking about some of these issues. And I think the risk is that these become total institutions. These people working in these units with access to the tools, lawful intercept, DAA filter, requesting to service providers for IP logs and things. They create a social norm of we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. And those tools, and this is a Kiwi guy. She has similar cultural background to I, and is working in DIA, which is a fairly reputable government organisation. And still, he was saying things like, I don't like Google because they won't give me IP records of, it's an easy way for the pedos to hide their tracks. That's what I'm concerned about. I know it exists. As you've just heard, I've got first-hand experience of this sort of total institution that occurs. And that's the problem. And I think Debbie touched on it. It's the overstepping of the due process. That's the issue. Lawful intercept's another great example, is that in that I have no problem with having a search warrant to tap into someone's internet connection. Someone has to physically go and install it. But we're at the point now where we have a system where we can just click on a record on a computer screen and it'll bring up a tap on their phone and internet connection. That's a problem. Someone's going to abuse that because there's no due process, or the due process is open to abuse rather, because the system makes it easy to.
Thanks, Joel. Yeah, just the comment about the UK proposal. It's causing a huge debate in the UK, particularly among civil society groups and many others. This idea, there's a new law that when you sign up to your ISP, you should have to opt in if you want to receive lawful adult sexual content on the internet. And there are many child rights groups, but actually just groups who think, oh, that's a really great idea, and then I don't have to get it. I just have, and the whole premise that you would have to sign up to access lawful content, I think, is the chilling effect of that. Yep, Daniel, behind you. So.
There's two problems with the UK filtering scheme. Is that the filter won't catch everything. So if you sign up by default, you're filtered, and you have children, you go, oh, my internet's filtered, I don't need to worry about it. Well, actually, no, you still do, because the filters won't catch everything. And secondly, the problem is, assumedly, the ISP in the UK has a record saying you've signed up for porn. Currently, that's not a problem with the current UK government. What about the next one, or the one after that? They can go into the ISP and get the records. They might even do it illegally and bust you for something else, or they don't like you because you've looked at porn, or they just passed laws saying you can't look at this kind of porn, and there's all these people that have signed up to look at porn, we're going to go and screw with them. So.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. While the microphone gets to Clifford, we haven't heard from you. We end up talking about child sex and pornography a lot when we talk about freedom of expression online, whereas in fact in many countries in the world those are not the freedom of expression issues that people are facing. They're actually their political views, they're actually their right to associate online, their sexual freedom to be lesbian or gay, or just to associate with the cultural minority. So do keep that in mind in terms of these discussions as we're not only talking about those topics. Clifford.
Thank you. If you think that police have time to look at everybody looks at porn, you're living in dreamland. Yeah, that really would be a police state. I think the comments that the sensible comments that have come out of this are really good. The internet is just an extension of normal life. You have rights to get onto the internet because you pay for it, just like you pay for your car or the bus or whatever to get from A to B. But you also have the responsibilities, and you have to abide by the law. And the laws are set by the government of the day, and the government of the day is voted for by the population. So you get what you pay for. And that whole circular, that whole process works all the way around, regardless of whether it's in real life, as in person, or on the internet.
Clifford, other views, different perspectives?
I'd guess I feel slightly less common sensey about it. I think both government and the private sector, it's a bit like putting foxes in charge of their hen house. I think we need something that's much more constant and much longer term to protect us, and a reference point to make sure, or to try and prevent the kind of excesses that we know governments are actually undertaking. Human rights frameworks, I think, offer us, we don't need to reinvent necessarily that wheel. There might be other ways of doing it, but human rights frameworks are well explored. We've had a lot of experience with them. They may well include other things as well, other than internet access, for instance, and a sort of freedom on the internet as well, and to protect us against the sort of to do some antitrust work as well in the private sector, as well as protecting our privacy and right to free speech and political activism on the internet as well.
Thanks, Jim. Yes, Kim?
I just wanted to sort of follow up the previous speaker to Jim, and it's all very well saying government of the day is voted in it. We're not only talking about New Zealand. There are other places where perhaps there is less choice in your government, and that's where it really matters, and that goes right back to your point about freedom of association on the web, which is hugely important.
Okay, we've just got a couple more minutes, so just any other comments, any burning issue that you wanted to raise that hasn't been? Yes, Chris?
I think in the balance of things that you do, there are obviously those who say there ought to be the utmost freedom and those who call for the filters and controls. Somewhere along the line there is a middle process, and that is to have ready access to remedies if there is any abuse of this. And I think part of the whole concept of human rights, and in fact, of course, it's in the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act, is that ready access to that sort of help that you need when there is a problem. So if, for example, you complain that DIA is filtering your perfectly legitimate line of pornographic pictures, you have the ability to go and see, I think it's the Ombudsman or the censor or somebody like that. And as long as you have the ability to access those means of ensuring there is fairness, then you do achieve some sort of balance.
Thanks. Debbie, I see you reacting to that.
Well, I think that's great when it's all happening in New Zealand, but I think what we've seen recently with the actions by the US government and law enforcement in the US is that their actions have actually impacted on citizens from another country. So I think a big issue is the cross-jurisdictional matters and the fact that how do you respond to a situation where you're sitting in New Zealand but you've got something hosted in the States and all of a sudden you've lost access to it because of actions taken somewhere else. And I think that that is an issue, I believe, with the internet being global, we need to sort out cross-jurisdictional issues.
Yeah, thanks, Debbie. It's definitely a case in the mega upload for sure, is those people lawfully storing content and on mega upload and unable to access it for the last 6 months through entirely nothing that they've done wrong. So there is a question around limitations and proportionality, which I think often gets not talked about. The least restrictive measures.
Sorry, I just want to jump in
Joel,
before
and then
it strays
the
too
one
far again, because this came up before and then we moved on to something. I'm not sure what happened with the outcome of the technical implementation. This is a slightly technical question, but my understanding, being on the PAG list for the filter when it was first put in, was it was a bit of BGP, route injection, jiggery pokery, and some HTTP DNS hijacking. It doesn't actually display a page. You just get a 404 from memory.
Yeah, you do.
You don't know you're being filtered.
Yeah.
So how
you
can
get
you
a-
apply to? You do have a page? Okay, sorry. When we were looking at it,
You have attempted to access.
obviously I'm a good boy. I never look at anything that gets filtered.
It has not been logged.
I was just in the last minute, I've got person behind and then...
Sorry, just one thing to
Yep.
follow on to that. The problem also with any of these approaches is it creates a let's watch list. And I know we did discuss that as part of the PAG advisory, is that effectively by having a filter in place, we're creating have a look at these sites list for those that have access to it. So that's another issue to be concerned about. And it goes back to what we're talking about with the UK, is it gives an avenue for hate groups to basically go and grab some names.
Yeah, it's a good point, because I know in Pakistan, for example, one of our members there pointed us to a government tender request for services to filter 50 million URLs, and they're basically gearing up to just entirely filter for political content. So the question is not necessarily even in relation to our own child sexual exploitation filter, but the technology exists to filter, therefore how and why will it be used. So yes, you, and then I think Hamish to the end. Yep.
I just want to acknowledge the fact that any sort of filtering system is certainly open to abuse. I'd like to think that we lived in a country that had numerous checks and balances in its system, that probably those abuses would be much less likely to happen than some other countries. But I'd also just like to point out the fact that one of the rights that I believe people have when they do surf online is the right not to be harmed while surfing online. And I could give you numerous websites, but one good example was a website I came across during the Rugby World Cup that was selling tickets to the World Cup. A couple of people have reported considerable losses to this website, and then when I went online, there was bulletin boards for Africa with streams of complaints about this website that is just basically online ripping people off in a very large global scam. And I certainly believe that there ought to be some system that would allow that site to be removed so that people had the right to not be harmed by it.
Yep, thanks. And there are systems for takedown, for sure. Hamish, the final word to you, and then we're getting the word that we need to give access to someone else to the room.
Yeah, sorry, I was just very impressed both with the gentleman who believes that New Zealand is beyond any kind of corruption, and Debbie's comments about it's okay if you're in New Zealand. It probably is, as long as your name's not Kim.com. They kind of came here and did enforcement theatre at a very high level. The one thing that's really puzzled me now that I look back on it is that we've got through this whole session about human rights and access, and yet the Section 92A disconnection from the internet after 3 strikes and bad behaviour hasn't been raised at all. It just seems to have dwindled in our consciousness mercifully rapidly.
Yeah,
Thank you, anyway.
We need to not forget it. All right, well, thank you very much. We're getting the word that we need to move, but it's been an interesting discussion. I hope you've learnt something. Please continue it in the break. Thanks.